The relationship between Blair and Brown was one of the most successful and then the most toxic, potentially, that this country has seen in modern politics. We're now seeing a very similar dynamic in the Conservative Party. Boris Johnson, Theresa May. How does this end with your political antennae? How does this wash out?
I do think I think both Tony and Gordon were brilliant in different ways. I don't think anybody really looks at Theresa May and thinks she's a brilliant Prime Minister. I'm not sure anybody around the world looks at Boris Johnson and thinks he's a brilliant Foreign Secretary. I think what we're seeing playing out at the moment is the 7th Tory leader being torn apart because the Tory party just cannot bring itself to unite on Europe.
Should she have resigned? If you'd been advising her, would you have said after that election shock, which is what it was, she didn't lose, but she may as well have lost, would you have advised her to resign? Was it a mistake to try and hang on?
No, probably not. Probably not. I mean, look, she got a mandate. It's just that her authority is massively weakened. And if she resigns, who's going to take over?
Would Tony Blair have fired Boris Johnson for what he's done this week if that had been his Foreign Secretary?
He didn't fire Gordon, but I think Gordon was, as I say, I think Gordon was in a different league to something like Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson, we're leaving the European Union because Boris Johnson used the referendum to try and bring down one Prime Minister, David Cameron, and then she got in on the back of it rather than him. And now he's playing exactly the same game.
Yeah, but
so
there'll
the answer is probably yes.
There'll be plenty of people who, you know, you come from a particular political standpoint. There will be people who think Boris Johnson was such an important voice in the Leave campaign.
Yeah.
It's partly down to his campaigning
Correct.
that Leave won. We have leading our country at the moment a Prime Minister who was on the Remain side and a Chancellor who was on the Remain side. And there is a huge argument for saying that somebody from the Leave side who won the campaign should be Prime Minister.
Well, she became Prime Minister because the Tory MPs elected her as their leader. But Boris Johnson is the Foreign Secretary. There he is at the United Nations General Assembly. Honestly, I speak to other foreign ministers around Europe and around the world. They think he's a joke. This whole buffoon act, it's really damaging Britain. And if he's... Look, the Cabinet, and I'm not pretending there weren't big rows in our Cabinet, of course there were, but the Cabinet is the place to thrash this stuff out. These people can't spend 5 minutes in the same room without splurging out their differences to the press.
We've had the worst year in this country for terror attacks the country's ever had. Most of it is driven by Islamic radicalisation fundamentalism, right? This is Islamist attacks. Many people say that the decisions taken by Tony Blair, when you were working with him, the war in Iraq, which many thought was completely wrong, that this stirred up the Middle East issues, made it 10 times worse, encouraged, inspired ISIS. We are now paying in blood the price for decisions made in the period you talk about in that book by your boss.
I think that is, I know people say that, I know a lot of people think that. I think it's too simplistic a view of what was happening then and now.
But is there an element of truth to it?
I think, look, could you find people who were radicalised because of the war in Iraq? Of course you could. But what happened after the war in Iraq, and you look at all the countries that didn't take part in the war in Iraq, I always think of France. France actually has probably had more terrorism heaped upon it than we have. And yet, Chirac at the time was vehemently opposed to the war in Iraq. So I think this idea that we can isolate ourselves by not getting engaged in the really difficult decisions, and I think where we are now with this, I think, and people have sort of wiped out September the 11th as though it kind of, you know, that was a turning point in this. That was the moment at which I think the countries like Britain and America realised we cannot stay out of this
September the 11th was committed by a bunch of terrorists sponsored by people in Saudi Arabia. Had nothing to do with Saddam Hussein. Why did we go to war in Iraq over 9/11?
No, I'm simply...
It had nothing to do with it.
Except we went to war in Afghanistan over 9/11, and that hasn't helped, has it?
Jihadic Islamism. And that...
But I think a lot of the problems were caused by... We waged the wrong war. We went to war with a guy who had nothing to do with 9/11. We stirred up a massive hornet's nest. We left Iraq as a total shambles. Through that came ISIS. We emboldened them, and we're now paying the price for it.
ISIS is a part of a narrative that was developing before 9/11, through 9/11, through the war in Afghanistan, through the war in Iraq. I'm not denying that, as I say, you will find people who will say that was the turning point for them. You will find a lot of the people, for example, who are being radicalised in British prisons. Yeah. I'm sure we'll talk about Iraq.
Final
I'm simply
point.
saying it's not the only
Final
thing.
point. Because you paint a fascinating picture of all the central players in this. Is it sad for you that Tony Blair, who won 3 elections, was one of the most popular breaths of fresh air we've seen in this country, is now pretty much despised in Britain? Every time he pops his head up, it's just universal loathing.
Because of that one issue?
You know, because of the Iraq War. Is it sad to you that someone that was such a popular guy in Britain is now so unpopular?
I do find it sad. I also think it's incredibly unfair. And I think that I'm glad that Tony stays engaged in the debate. Listen, this book starts with him getting a majority of 66, right? And within 2 days, Blair must go, say Labour MPs. What would Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn give for that now?
True.
And I think, look, he's a very bright guy. He's got amazing qualities.